The New York Mets have reportedly offered Kyle Tucker a 4-year deal, which could be worth as much as $200 million. The question now is, are they willing to up their bid again if it means getting a deal done?
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're listening to Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day, and thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. On the show today, we're going to talk about Kyle Tucker. In the first segment, I'll get into all the recent reporting about the Kyle Tucker sweepstakes. In the second segment, I want to talk about if the Mets would be willing to go to $250 million on a 5-year deal to get Tucker to sign. Then in the final segment, I want to talk about what the reaction will be if the Mets are unable to come up with Tucker. Are fans going to let them off the hook because this pursuit was good enough, or are fans going to hold it against the Mets for not getting a deal done? Before we get to any of that, though, I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. I've been covering the New York Mets on this show since the 2019 season. This is the #1 daily podcast on the New York Mets. Want to find some of my written work? You can do so over at justbaseball.com, where I work as the editor-in-chief. Now, let's start things off with the first report that we got on Wednesday, and that was from Jim Duquette. And we have to give Jim Duquette some credit. He seems to have been pretty plugged into this situation. Maybe he's got a connection to Kyle Tucker's agent. Regardless, Jim Duquette started off the day by reporting that the Mets had likely added a 4th year to their offer on Tucker. And then throughout the day, I think the general consensus sort of became that the Mets had a 4-year, $200 million deal on the table for Kyle Tucker. Now, that specific 4 years, $200 million deal, I don't know if we've gotten it specifically reported that is exactly what's on the table, but I think what everyone's reading into is now the assumption that the Mets offer is for 4 years, and also working off the other assumption of what has been reported that the Mets contract offer to Kyle Tucker has been worth $50 million per year. Later on in the night, Michael Moreno, who does have sources, and he has been right before, so he's not the most notable of insiders, but he has been working on Met sources for some time. He does have a report out there on X where he reported that the Mets short-term $50 million offer yesterday, which would have been Tuesday for Kyle Tucker, did not include deferrals. He said it was unclear if any offers that have made sense that have maintained that same structure. So based on all the reporting and trying to connect the dots, what we may be able to assume at this point is the New York Mets put an aggressive 3-year, $150 million contract in front of Kyle Tucker as their offer that started all of this, right? Where they put together an AAV that was probably higher than anything that they were expecting. I think the hope going into this offseason might have been that Tucker was going to be able to land a contract that was worth $40 million per year, but on a long-term deal. $50 million, I don't think anyone was expecting him to get Juan Soto money. The Mets are putting Soto money on the table per year for Kyle Tucker. And again, maybe it started with a 3-year deal at $150 million, and maybe there was an opt-out after year 2. Now, if they've sweetened that offer and they've added a 4th year, kept a similar structure, maybe it's opt-outs after year 2 and year 3, and it's the $50 million per. I'm very curious where the opt-outs are in this short-term deal, because that definitely can change things. If the Mets put an opt-out after the first year, it is more attractive to Tucker, because if he has a monster season in 2026, he can immediately test the market. But for the Mets, if they're going to put this much on the table for Tucker per year, plus giving up the draft pick compensation and the international bonus pool money that it would take to sign him because he has a qualifying offer attached, maybe they want to ensure that they have 2 years of Kyle Tucker. So they put that out there after the second year. And if that was the case, and the first deal was obviously not getting it done, you could see how the front office would rationalize, you know what? Let's throw a fourth year on this thing. Maybe there is only one opt-out after year 2, but let's throw a fourth year on it. So essentially, you are making 2 separate 2-year, $100 million bets on Kyle Tucker. You're betting on Tucker to have a great 2 years in a Mets uniform and opt out after that second year, after his age 30 season. Or you are betting then that if he opts in, age 31 and age 32 of Kyle Tucker would still be worth $100 million over a 2-year span. If that's where the Mets are at, that's a very competitive offer. They don't have to move off of that at all. But the Blue Jays are still in the race. And the thing is, they aren't bidding on the same playing field. The Mets are bidding short-term high AAV, and the Blue Jays are trying to give Kyle Tucker years, where they're trying to sell Kyle Tucker on the vision of, hey, it's you and it's Vladdy, and we're going to build around that combination, right-handed batter, left-handed batter. You are going to be the second biggest piece on this team. You guys are the focal point. We're building everything around you, and we're building around you for a decade. Jeff Passan has reported, or he said on a show, he said the Blue Jays are the only team that's shown the willingness to go as deep as 10 years potentially. So if that is true, if there's a 10-year offer on the table from the Blue Jays, what is that offer? Did they come out strong at the beginning of the offseason and say, hey, we'll give you 10 years for $250 million, and that's been the sticking point this whole time, that he was only going to get $25 million per? Probably not. I think the offer would be a little more aggressive. Maybe it was $300 million over 10 years. And they put that offer out there at the beginning of the offseason, and they didn't think anybody was going to match it or beat it, and they didn't want to bid against themselves. So maybe Tucker has been sitting on $300 million all offseason and waiting for a bidding war to take place that will drive that average annual value up. Now that you have the Mets, though, if the Mets are offering $200 million over 4 years and you have $300 million over 10 years on the table, it's pretty easy to envision a world where you play out the Mets contract, and over the next 6 years, you can eclipse the $100 million of difference in guaranteed money that you would get if you took the Blue Jays contract. You have 6 more free agent years at that point to make even $25 million per, and you clear it by $50 million. Now, if the Blue Jays have upped their bid based on the Mets with their aggressive high average annual value deal, if they've now sweetened the pot and it's 10 for 320, well, now the AAV is going up. Definitely makes it a sweeter deal. Maybe they stretch that to 330, 340, 350. If the Blue Jays are willing to get to $350 million on a 10-year deal, I find it hard to believe that Kyle Tucker is going to walk away from that. Because even if he just plays out the 2 years, right? Plays out the first 2 years of the Mets, makes $100 million, hits free agency after his age 30 season. Let's say he then gets $35 million per, and he signs a 7-year deal. Was that the Randon and the Strasburg contract? Was it $245? Yeah, it is. That's $245 million. You take the $100 million from the first 2 years with the Mets. Even then, over a 9-year window, you're only getting a $345 million. And again, if the Blue Jays were to get that offer to $350, I feel like they get a deal done, and that might be where this thing goes. Where the Blue Jays just have to tack on a little bit more so that Kyle Tucker just takes the long-term guarantee. It's a lot more comfortable for the player to just sign the lifetime contract now, not have to worry about performing in New York for 2 years to get the next deal. You're just done. And that, I think, is still probably a more likely outcome than the Mets getting this thing done if they stick at their current offer. But what if the Mets throw another year on the deal? Could one more year get this thing done where a 5-year contract has Kyle Tucker signed with the Mets? I want to talk about that possibility here in just a minute. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel is officially in playoff mode where every game day during the NFL playoffs, FanDuel is giving customers even more ways to get in on the action because right now, every NFL playoff game day, FanDuel is going to give users a chance at profit boost packs that are waiting for them inside the app. Each game day, you'll see a pack loaded with multiple profit boosts that you can apply to the bets that you like the most. So you are not being forced into a specific bet. You open up your profit boost packs the first thing on game day, and you see what boosts apply, and then you can use those boosts and lean into your game day instincts, whether you're backing momentum, defense, quarterback play. The boost will give you more juice on the bets that you already like instead of forcing you to bet something new. Every play feels bigger, and the boosts make your bets feel that way too. You make your picks, then you apply those profit boosts to go after an even bigger payout while the playoffs are rolling. So visit FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL, and grab your profit boost pack every NFL playoff game day. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Help us get closer to our next goal of 16,000 subscribers. Now, if the Mets have a 4-year, $200 million deal on the table, would they consider upping it and adding a 5th year at the same average annual value? Would they consider making it 5 for $250 for Kyle Tucker? You put an opt-out after year 2, put an opt-out after year 4, maybe because you're giving him a 5th year, maybe the opt-out is just after years 3 and year 4, and you commit to Kyle Tucker where you're going to give him $250 million over 5 years to play a corner outfield spot for you. You are buying, I think, the majority of his prime, but if you're Kyle Tucker, you still have the opportunity again to opt out and potentially get a bigger deal, but you have the security of knowing, hey, even if this is the last contract that I sign, I have $250 million in the bank, and I'm going to be getting paid $50 million per over the next 5 years. That right there might be the difference. That might get a deal done. If the Blue Jays go to 350, but you're sitting at 250 over 5 and they're at 350 over 10, all you got to do if you're Kyle Tucker, play out the deal. If you have opt-outs, great. You'll have a chance maybe still to hit free agency and get the 7 or 8 year deal. But all you got to do when you get to the other side of a 5-year deal, if you play the whole thing out, and again, if you had $350 million on the table from the Blue Jays, all you have to do over the next 5 years is exceed $100 million, and you end up with a better deal. And Kyle Tucker, even after playing the next 5 seasons, would still have a chance to make more money in free agency. And again, he could opt out after 3 years, having collected $150 million, and go out in the market and get himself potentially a $250 million deal where he ends up making more. I think what we don't know is the difference in what's going to happen here. What we don't know is where the Blue Jays offer stands. What we don't know is what the Dodgers are thinking. Are the Dodgers going to get in on this and put together a bid similar to what the Mets have on the table? Those are the things that are probably going to decide this. How aggressive are the Dodgers to stay in this race? Because the Dodgers, you would imagine, are the team that any free agent might choose to play for above all others, just because it's a chance to play on this virtual super team, have an unbelievable chance to win a World Series, and you don't have to have the pressure of being the guy that carries the team every day. So I think there's still this wild card that you can't completely discount. How many times in the past have we seen the Dodgers pull something off? We're like, oh, the Dodgers did it again. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it does feel at this stage like it's more likely Blue Jays or Mets. And so then again, it just comes down to what the Blue Jays are willing to offer in terms of average annual value. If they get to $35 million per, I think they get the player. I really do. But again, the Mets have the ability to make it really tough on Toronto here. And you're also selling him on the vision of being a Met too. That can't be just thrown aside, it's not entirely money. Most of the time it is strongly about who pays you the most, but there is still a decision that has to be made. If the Mets can pull this thing off, not only do they do it financially, but they also convinced him that this was a good place to spend the next big chapter of his career. So it would be a huge win for this franchise, as we've been talking about, to get this thing done. And I think if you already have stretched the point where you're willing to offer $50 million per over 4 years, I don't know what the harm is in adding a 5th year, because I think the assumption is this guy's going to be good and he's going to opt out of this contract. And so I think if it took a 5th year, go to a 5th year. I also imagine that deferrals could start to take effect the longer this contract gets. And so I would not assume that it's going to be a straight deal. Juan Soto's was, I think, a completely straight deal, right? I don't think there's any deferred money in that one. The Mets could go that route again here. But if they end up getting to a 5-year deal, I would not be surprised at all if they wanted to work some deferrals in. That would take the present day value closer to $225 million, where you're talking about $45 million per instead of $50 million per. But ultimately, you still collect all the money nonetheless. It's just a matter of how you structure the deferrals to take down the present day value so the Mets won't get hit as hard on the luxury tax. But this just seems like a player where Steve Cohen is ready to throw caution to the wind and buy. This is an auction. This is a piece of art that he has decided that he wants, that David Stearns has informed him or consulted him that this is the guy they should make this level of pursuit for, and they're going for it. And the one thing I want to say before we get to the final segment, I hate the notion now that it's been reported that Steve Cohen is in the mix, that all of a sudden David Stearns is sitting on the sidelines and Steve Cohen has taken over these negotiations. That's not how this works. The owner gets involved on any big signing. The Orioles did not sign Pete Alonso without a sign-off from, I don't even remember who the new owner's name is now. But they did not just, it wasn't just Mike Elias. David Rubenstein had to sign off on that deal. And if you're going to offer a player $50 million per, that deal has to be signed off on by ownership. It doesn't mean that ownership is the one that is completing the deal and the GM or the president has nothing to do with it. David Stearns doing all the legwork on this stuff. David Stearns, I'm sure, is leading those meetings when you have a meeting with Kyle Tucker. But Steve Cohen being involved, of course, it does help because he's the guy that cashes the check, or that cuts the check, cashes the check. Kyle Tucker would be cashing the check in this instance. So, yeah, Steve Cohen's involved. Not surprising we were talking about a commitment this serious. David Stearns can't just put a $200 million bid in on Kyle Tucker and then call Steve up after and say, hey, is this okay? I just committed an offer for $200 million of your money over the next 4 years. You cool with that? Like, he has to get signed off. So I would not read into Steve Cohen's involvement other than to say that the New York Mets are clearly in this. And I'll be curious how far they go to win these sweepstakes, which leads me to the final segment today. What happens if the Mets don't get Kyle Tucker? How are fans going to feel about it? We'll talk about that next. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day, and thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. You already live your team every day. Now it's time to take it up a level and go ad-free. Join the Everyday Club today and get Locked On Mets without the interruptions. You also get access to our members-only Discord channel. We could talk to other Locked On Mets fans and access to a merch shop. If you want to be a Locked On Mets, if you want to be part of the Locked On Mets Everyday Club, go to lockedonmets.supercast.com to learn more. Now, let's just say the Blue Jays do put 10 for $350 on the table and Kyle Tucker signs at 2 o'clock today when you guys are maybe listening to this even. But after you've listened here in the middle of the afternoon, Kyle Tucker is a Blue Jay. It's going to be disappointing. There's no doubt about it because your pivot at this point very well could be trading for Lars Nootbaar and signing Austin Hayes and forming a platoon in left field. I can 100% see that as the pivot point for the Mets. And I also will say, it's not something where a deal gets done and now the Mets have to canvass the market and see what's out there. They know what's out there. I'm sure the Mets already have a Lars Nootbaar trade that's on the goal line that they just have to push through, where I'm sure at this point the Cardinals have probably expressed some prospects that they're interested in. The Mets have probably agreed in some way, or at least have an idea of what it would take to get Nootbaar. And so once the Tucker thing ends, they might just pivot immediately. So you might see a quick reaction if the Mets don't sign Kyle Tucker. I think we just saw that with the Red Sox today. Alex Bregman, they wanted him. He signs elsewhere. What do? They quickly pivot. They get the best free agent for them, which was Ranger Suarez. They did not think, I guess, that they would win the Bo Bichette bidding. So they just focus on Ranger and they get a new starting pitcher to add into the fold. Very similar to what we saw last year when Juan Soto signed with the Mets. The Yankees immediately went to Max Fried. It's just addressing your next, adding the free agent that you think is the best investment, not necessarily the best roster fit. So I don't think if the Mets miss out on Tucker, they're all of a sudden going to pivot and put all their money on Cody Bellinger. I don't think so. I think it's more likely they go the trade route. And then I think the free agent spending very well could then be done where the Mets decide to invest in Framber Valdez, who now, after Ranger Suarez has signed, and for, by the way, $130 million over 5 years, that's $26 million per. Now, all of a sudden, Framber is standing in a great spot to get $150 million over 5 years. Get a little more average annual value. He's been a better, more consistent pitcher than Ranger. And so I think there could be a good market that develops here late in free agency for Framber, where it's going to take a lot to get him. So hopefully the Mets just land Kyle Tucker. But again, if they don't, how will the fan base react? I think the fan base is going to be pissed. I think the fan base is going to take it out on Stearns because that is the pattern that we've seen throughout this offseason. But personally, the Mets have already gone above and beyond what I would expect. To put $50 million per on the table, too, which is something that I talked about at the beginning of the offseason. And it wasn't the beginning of the offseason. It was probably after the Pete Alonso decision, where I said, who knows? Maybe the Mets get on Kyle Tucker, but they're probably not going to go to years. What do? Throw 2 years, $100 million at him? Do they even go to 3? Like, is 3 for 150? Is it 4 for 200? Like, we were talking about all this stuff. It's a crazy hypothetical. Now that's a reality. Now they put that on the table. Now they really try to get something done. I applaud the Mets for being aggressive in this pursuit. I do think if you want to, and maybe we'll spend some time on it, whether the Mets sign Tucker or not, just how they have gone about this offseason, and not to rehash everything on Pete Alonso, but if they sign Tucker to a 4-year, $200 million deal, I get that Kyle Tucker's a better all-around player. I get that Kyle Tucker's younger. I get that he, by a WAR perspective, overall value to a ball club, is a not just better player than Pete Alonso, a much better player based on what the metrics would tell you. The ceiling of what Kyle Tucker could perform for you, for what he could produce for you, is MVP-like production. Pete, his bat's always going to be there, but the complete package is not. He's going to post, but I still, the processing that as a fan that loved Pete Alonso, the fact that they would go $45 million past what Pete Alonso signed for for a shorter deal, that they would give more total money over less years to Tucker than they were willing to match on Alonso. You can make a case that they would have been better off just to get the Pete Alonso signing done, but clearly that was not this front office's MO. And if they get Kyle Tucker, you have a better chance at a all-around team that can be better at run prevention. Kyle Tucker does, in the past, have Gold Glove pedigree. He did win one, but that was a while ago. That was, 2022 that Kyle Tucker won a Gold Glove, I believe? Or was it 20? His defensive metrics 2 years ago that were insane. So, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if he won it in, let's see. He won it in 22, yeah. Silver Slugger in 23, Silver Slugger this past year. And then an all-star the last 4 seasons. He also finished 5th in the MVP voting in 2023. So, yeah, I mean, again, you're talking about a ridiculously good player. And so the fan base is going to be upset if the Mets don't pull this off. But I don't think it'll necessarily be fair to blame the Mets front office if this deal doesn't get done. because, again, they have taken this further than I think any of us would have expected. And if Kyle Tucker doesn't sign with the Mets, it's more likely that it's because he signed a long-term deal with the Blue Jays. And a 10-year deal is significant. Now, if he signs with the Dodgers for less money, that's going to sting a lot. But right now, we don't really have any intel on how in the Dodgers really are on this situation. This could happen today, though. Mike Puma had reported that it was not going to happen on Wednesday night, could happen on Thursday. So I will be going live if and when a decision is made, regardless of the decision. If he signs with the Blue Jays, he signs with the Dodgers, either way, I know how much we've all been kind of keyed into this story, so I'm going to break it down regardless of what happens. And we'll see how the Mets would pivot if they don't sign Kyle Tucker. Feels like they got a chance now, though. And again, that's just not something that any of us could have realistically expected. Even after Pete Alonso left, and we mentioned the possibility of the Mets signing Bellinger or Tucker. Even then, it didn't seem like Tucker was realistic. It always felt like, okay, maybe they get it on Cody Bellinger. But now I would be stunned if they sign Bellinger. I think it's Kyle Tucker or bust when it comes to addressing this outfield in a meaningful way to the fan base, I'll say, because you can still form that Lars Nootbaar, Austin Hayes platoon and address this roster in a meaningful way. I do think those two guys could combine to give you above average production in left field. It's just not what any of us were anticipating, right? That you would trade Brandon Nimmo, trade Jeff McNeil, and end up with Nootbaar and Hayes. But again, it's not the worst option in the world. And if the Mets would pivot from there and spend on Framber, I think as long as they ultimately spend and make a couple big additions, I think they're going to get to a final picture of this roster that fans are going to like. But nothing at this point could compare to a Kyle Tucker Mets team. Like, there's no other moves that can be made that would be more impactful. So, like all of you, I'm holding out hope that we get some good news and Kyle Tucker is Juan Soto's teammate by the weekend. Anyway, that's going to be all for this edition of Locked On Mets. Really appreciate all of you for tuning in. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Subscribe if you are watching on YouTube. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. And thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network.